so I guess I should stand here, right? Because otherwise I disappear behind the podium. Told you that was going to happen. Good evening, and thank you so much for coming to another one of our Kislak in-depth programs, something we do because the collection at the Kislak Center in the Freedom Tower is presently closed for renovation, sadly, for those of us, and I know many of you have seen that collection, and it is amazing. So we are collaborating with various institutions to put together a series of programs. So for the commercial, and I have to read this. Usually I don't read anything, but you can know why I'm reading it. For those who do not know, I first want to talk to you a little bit about the Kislak Center itself, which opened to the public in 2018. Made possible by a generous donation by the J.I. Kislak Foundation, the Kislak Center includes some of the most significant original source materials related to the history of the early Americas. We have extraordinary objects, books, maps, manuscripts, pre-Columbian artifacts, and other historical materials that offer perspectives on the collections and the civilizations that shaped the modern world. Kislak made the collection available to both scholars and the community through the foundation, which donated more than 3,000 important items to be permanently exhibited at the historic Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., to his alma mater, the University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Miami, and the Miami-Dade College, the Freedom Center. Tonight, our event is co-sponsored by, and we love this collaboration. When we said we wanted to do a collaboration, we didn't realize how many people really, institutions wanted to collaborate with us. So we're very proud to say that this is co-sponsored by HistoryMiami, of course, thank you, the Kislak Center at the Museum of Art and Design, to my colleagues who are here, Miami-Dade College, and the University of Miami Center for the Humanities, the Low Art Museum, NAGAS, which is Native American and Global Indigenous Studies, and LISG, Libraries Indigenous Studies Group. Isn't that great? I mean, really, we're very happy to do this. All of which we can relate to the study of the ancient Americas, including the collections at the Low Art Museum, with holdings including architectural elements, pottery, textiles, figurines, and archaeological objects of the ancient Americas as well. So these collaborations are really ideal for the subjects that we cover in our Kislak programs, and which is, the subject is the ancient Americas, a very significant subject in Miami, and I think you've all been following what's happening, happily and unhappily. There was even a headline in the paper today about calling some of these sites historic, but so what, right? So that was not a very promising article. The headline looked promising, but then when you keep reading, you know, well, who knows? So before I introduce Traci, who is going to talk about that, I want you to know that we are going to do our next program in January at the Quebec Center, and it's going to be on Andean textiles, another aspect of our collection that is very near and dear to the hearts of many. If you want to see what we have done in the past, we do have a wonderful website. You can just Google Kislak Collections at Miami-Dade, and there are pamphlets back there that tell you how to do that, and you'll see some of the treasures that we've been featuring and the recordings of past programs as well. So, without further ado, where is Traci? Oh, there you are. I can't see over here, so I can't see you. Traci Ardren, professor of anthropology, the University of Miami, is an anthropological archaeologist interested in New World prehistoric cultures. Her research focuses on issues of identity and other forms of symbolic representation in the archaeological record, especially the ways in which differences are explained through gender. Traci co-directs the Matacumbe Chieftain Project, looking at the political organization and environmental adaptation of the pre-Hispanic occupants of the Florida Keys and adjacent areas of southern Florida. So, Traci, please come here and tell us about one of our favorite subjects, the Tequesta.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to make sure I stay on time here. Well, what a great turnout, and I see so many familiar faces from so many different areas of my life. It's just really, really exciting to share this information with you tonight and to see so many people interested in pre-Columbian or pre-contact Florida. Always we have a great turnout. Whenever Carol gives a talk, or whenever I give a talk, when Arthur, any of us in this room who've dedicated our lives to pre-contact studies of the Americas, we have so many people in this town who are interested and searching for information. So that was the impetus behind tonight's talk, was really to share. I've been digging into the Tequesta for years, reading, kind of obscure gray literature and writing to the state to ask for images. And I thought, this stuff is great. This story is really, really amazing, and I want to share it with more people. So thank you for being here. It makes it possible for me to share what I've learned. Okay, I got a pointer, I got a thing. So I want to make sure that we acknowledge that at this very moment, we are within ancient Tequesta. We are on the land of in the land of the Tequesta, on the edges of the Tequesta capital. So we acknowledge that. We acknowledge the disturbance that we've done to the ancestors by building the major city of Miami in this location, and we hope that at least we are showing some form of respect by sharing information about them and how amazing they were. If you didn't catch Richard Blanco, our dreamy county poet, he was posting this week about the site and the importance of preserving it. And so he mentioned something in his post that I often forget to mention, which is many Tequesta people, a few hundred Tequesta people, sought refuge in Cuba in the 1700s. And it's very interesting that, being here in Miami, this is an important point, really, to kind of, I circled back and said, let's put that in the talk, because many of you, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say probably some of you have Cuban heritage, and if you have Cuban heritage, you probably also have Indigenous heritage. And it's quite likely that people in this room are actually descended from the Tequesta as well. The Tequesta and the Calusa and some of the other southern Florida Indigenous people were seeking to escape the slaving that was done by the British in the 18th century, and they went to Havana. So Floridians went to Havana for refuge and found a home. While this talk is going to be about what we often call an ancient culture, I use that word as much as anybody else, it is also very much about now and what is happening now and about Indigenous people now. And I know most of you will recognize Betty. Betty Osceola is an activist, a member of the Miccosukee tribe of Florida, and a very powerful advocate for Indigenous rights, environmental rights, a protector of the Everglades, and she has been the spiritual leader of our efforts to try and save the site downtown. I also want to say that I'm not an Indigenous person, and that I acknowledge that my perspective will not be what an Indigenous person would offer on this site. My position is as a white person with Central European heritage who's had all the advantages that brings of access to education and information. And my hope with this talk is that I am using that privilege a little bit to bring information out to the general public and hopefully to a broader audience. And I look forward to hearing what Indigenous people say about this information as it comes out and becomes more publicly available. So if you've been reading the news at all, You notice that Miami's been in the news a lot in terms of this archaeological site, even venues like Wall Street Journal, which doesn't necessarily scream archaeology in most cases. And of course, we actually are privileged to have in the room the reporter who's done the most for this story, the Miami Herald. But basically, there's been a lot of attention, national attention, international attention to this capital of the Tequesta downtown. I wanted to take just a moment to say why I think this is and why talking about the Tequesta is important. The story of Miami is a particular one, but it is also a situation which is repeated over and over again around the US and around the world, where a modern urban development is expanding upon the roots of an indigenous past. And so part of the reason, obviously, why the Wall Street Journal is interested in this story is, how is the archaeology going to thwart or slow down this rapid redevelopment that we have going on downtown? But more than that, it's about, and a lot of this coverage brings this out, what are the choices we're making today about heritage and cultural heritage, and how are those going to impact the future of Miami? So in the case of Miami, we're making choices to redevelop downtown, which is an exciting thing. When I moved here 20 years ago, really nobody was downtown at this hour. It was very, very quiet. And so now a whole bunch of people live downtown, and that's good. That means we don't expand into the Everglades as much. However, it comes at a price, and that price has been the very rapid excavation and removal of the last traces of archaeological evidence for the Tequesta's capital, which was at the mouth of the Miami River, as you'll see in my talk. And so part of the reason we get so much attention, I think, is that other cities are facing this exact same issue. Other places in the world are facing this issue. And if you're in a city like Rome or Mexico City, obviously these are long-term issues that you have thought about and resolved and come to perhaps some, if not consensus, at least solutions as to how to preserve some cultural heritage while still encouraging development and growth. We are very much at the beginning of those conversations here in Miami, and I think even a night like tonight, when we're not going to necessarily focus on the problematic aspects of that development, is an important part of the conversation. We need to appreciate the cultures that existed here in order to make good and informed decisions about redevelopment. So I'm sure there will continue to be stories, and I'll tell you more about that, but lots of media coverage, I think, going forward. Okay. So let's get into who are the Tequesta. I often include images like the one of the assisted living facility because Florida is well known for naming things after things that used to be there, right? So we have lots of Indian Mound Drive and Indian Road and Indian Beach Place, where there's no Indians anymore. There's not even an Indian mound anymore. I grew up in Sarasota. The main road used to be called Indian Mound Road, and then 41 came through and leveled it. So the word Tequesta is reused a lot in lots of different places. There's even a town in Florida named Tequesta, right? So it is confusing what it means, and I wanted to just be real clear and make sure we all were on the same page on where this word comes from. So our best evidence for where it comes from the 1513 arrival of Ponce de Leon, the very, very famous Ponce de Leon, who is sailing up from Puerto Rico and along the Atlantic coast of Florida. He makes it a little farther north in here, probably to Cape Canaveral area, and then he turns around and comes back south, and he stops to reprovision for water, fresh water, and probably whatever he could find to eat. And there's controversy as to whether or not he comes ashore, but he does meet the chief of the Tequesta, the political leader, probably also the spiritual leader of the Tequesta. And in the description of that voyage is where we get the name Tequesta. So this image on the left is a very helpful reminder that this name comes from Spanish sources. This is a name that the Spanish, who are notorious for mangling indigenous words, recorded, and so we don't know really what the people called themselves. They probably, perhaps, used something similar to Tequesta. We don't have any examples of Tequesta language, unfortunately, so we can't really even extrapolate what they might have called themselves. But here's some basic facts. The image I wanted to make sure and tell you. So those are the names that we have from Spanish colonial sources. We talk about the Calusa, we talk about the Tequesta, and we talk about the Matecumbe, who are in the Keys, as being the political units, cultural and political units that existed in South Florida, let's say during the 16th century. Okay, so some basic facts. We're going to talk about all of these a little bit more in detail, but the Tequesta were expert hunter-fisher-gatherers. This is a term we use now to encompass the fact that these are coastal people. They're living off the resources of the sea and not practicing agriculture. For this, they are truly famous in archaeology and anthropology. This may not seem like a significant point to you, but most models of social complexity rely upon the idea that agriculture is necessary. You have to have an agricultural surplus. You have to have a lot of food in order for some people to sit around and just talk about politics all day. And the way to do that is to grow corn or wheat or something that provides tons of calories, right? And that you can store. And so when the Calusa and the Tequesta were first studied, it was thought, oh, they must have had corn. They grew in the interior of the state. However, that's now been completely resolved, and we know that they relied purely on marine resources. So wild foods and marine resources. So wild food diet. And so that's really significant and different and unusual. And the reason that they had that surplus food that they could sit around and talk about politics like agriculturalists is that the estuaries and waterways of South Florida are incredibly rich environmentally. So, if you live on the Gulf Coast, you can just walk straight into the Gulf of Mexico and harvest as many oysters as you can possibly eat in a day. Children can harvest those oysters. Elderly people can harvest those oysters. Shellfish are easily accessible. Here in South Florida, it's a little different. We have a shelf right off the coast, but fisheries are very, very, very rich. The Keys are still remain that kind of rich fishery if you have spent time there, which I hope you have. So they thrived on this wild food. They had plenty of food. Food scarcity only happens once the Europeans arrive and start to mess with the whole system. We know that Tequesta traded and exchanged items throughout the entire east coast of North America. I'm going to talk about and show you some examples of those, but there was very extensive trade. And we know that their primary settlement was right here under urban Miami. I should have mentioned at the beginning, we are going to have time for questions. So I'm going to wrap it up in time for us to have questions. If you have questions, just hold on. Don't forget them, though. All right. Also very grateful for this amazing illustration of ancient Tequesta. We're going to look at it again in just a moment, but the artist is right here. Okay, so the Tequesta, another thing that's a little bit confusing is that you will hear people talk about the Granada site, the Granada settlement. They'll mention Met 1. They'll talk about, now they say 444. These are all elements of the Tequesta settlement. The Tequesta are a name for a people, also a name for this particular site right here in downtown. So we know that it spanned both sides of the Miami River, perhaps for as far as a kilometer inland. We don't really know the edges of the settlement. That's really something that we're guessing at. That's based on what archaeology has been done in town, but it was a very sizable place. We know that there was a very large council house. This is my interpretation of the Miami Circle. Probably one of the best known features of the ancient Tequesta. It fits exactly within the tradition of other indigenous people of the Southeast. So most places, if you're in North Florida, if you're in Georgia, if you're in anywhere in the Southeast at this time period, there's a giant council house. If you've been to Tallahassee, you may have seen the one at Mission San Luis, which has been reconstructed. I really recommend going there. It's truly impressive. This was a ceremonial and political space, a gathering spot for people from the entire tribe, a place where the elites lived and performed the rituals which kept the universe going, and where they received visitors for diplomatic visits. So it was a multifunctional space, but it embodied sort of the center and power of the settlement. That's what the circle is, in my opinion. We also know that there was a very large burial mound. There were multiple burial mounds in downtown Miami. We're about to hear more about those in the next coming years, I think, as redevelopment continues. But there was one particularly large burial mound, which was on the North Shore, and it was leveled. And then we know that there were many other interesting features. So this image on the lower left is from Met 1. If you've been around since the 2015, you may have seen that picture. These are the circles that have been marked in white that were found on the North Shore underneath what is sometimes called Granada. And they're connected by walkways. So these are the foundations of buildings. We think that they were raised up off of the ground surface to help with natural water flows and sheeting, so people didn't have flooding. And people moved between them on these raised walkways, right? And so we see evidence of the walkways, we see evidence of docks along the shore of the river and of Biscayne Bay. We have evidence for food processing areas, all the components of daily life. Okay, how do we know about the Tequesta? I'm gonna assert a whole lot of things here tonight, and it's fair to ask, how do we know what we know? So we have 4 major sources for thinking about the Tequesta. These are the same sources that we use for understanding many of the indigenous cultures of the Americas. We have living indigenous people who are voices for the indigenous experience in this particular location, right? We have art. This is a little water bird, I believe, from the current excavations on the south shore of the river. So we have art that tells us about both technical skill, vision, what's appropriate subject matter for art, where art is used, how it's deployed to uphold values and beliefs. We also have Spanish sources. As I mentioned, we know that Ponce de Leon met the Tequesta chief, but then there are a few other Spanish sources as well that mention the Tequesta, and those are very helpful, but of course very biased because of Spanish sources. We're not in any way, shape, or form trying to be objective about the cultures that they described in the New World. And then finally, we have archaeology, which as an archaeologist, I believe is probably the most democratic of the sources, but also easily skewed as well. And so in the case of the Tequesta capital here in downtown, the archaeological record tells us tremendous things, which we'll talk about tonight, but also has been shaped by where development has happened in Miami. So it's not as if there's been an objective survey of the entire downtown area or Miami-Dade County. There's only been archaeology done when a new building or development is going to go in, and that's when we learn something about Tequesta. So each of them have their advantages, and it's really best to use them in concert. All right. Very quickly, I teach an entire semester-long course on Florida archaeology. Believe me, I'm not going to go into all that. I just feel it's necessary these days and to make sure people understand a couple of basic facts. One, which is super cool, which is that we now know that people arrived in Florida as far as 17,000 years ago. This is from evidence in the Panhandle and the sort of armpit of Florida up there in the Osceola River, where there are submerged tools, bone, food remains, all kinds of stuff from a really, really interesting site called Page Ladstone. It fits, though, a lot of other evidence in the state. This is some of the oldest material in North America, and it's usually preserved in an extraordinary manner by being submerged in water. And the reason that things are submerged in water is that our coastline changed very dramatically around 10,000 years ago. So when people first migrate down into the peninsula, it's twice as big as it is today, twice as wide. And so they may have traveled the coast, and we will probably never find those West Coast sites because they're under hundreds and hundreds of feet of water. But I guess that's mostly to say that a whole bunch of sites are submerged, and the state was a very different kind of place. South Florida hadn't even emerged from the water, really, at this point in time, and it happens more around like 5,000 years ago. Again, fast forwarding, we're just doing the highlights of Florida archaeology. We do have some very early evidence for complex cultures in South Florida. This is a schematic, right? Obviously, like an animator got busy with some archaeological information and created this schematic of a really cool site called Big Mound City, which is in Palm Beach County. At this point in time, people are building these monuments, these walkways, these small mounds, these ramps with shell and other kinds of material, but primarily with shell, and mounding them and then surfacing them and reusing them and rebuilding them. And we don't understand a whole lot about these sites around Lake Okeechobee. They're all clustered around Lake Okeechobee. Super interesting sites because they're massive. These are people who are, again, non-agriculturalists. They're living off of wild foods. And they're mounding and creating these different designs. Each one is different than the next, that are really complex and require some basic things, right? You gotta have a lot of people willing to work together to build one of these kind of sites. You gotta have somebody who has an idea and who's willing to be in charge and direct, or maybe a small team of people who are directing it. You gotta have the whole idea that's a good idea to spend your time doing this. You could be just sitting around, bird watching or something. But if you're gonna build something like this, it's a big project. So this is an indication to us of the kind of complexity that starts to lay the groundwork for the Tequesta, where you have somebody in charge, a whole bunch of people who think the person in charge has probably got some good ideas. You've got resources, you've got free time, right? You've got enough to eat that you can sit around and think about building something like this. And then you can actually do it, right? Maybe it took 1,000 years to build it, but we know it didn't actually. It was a whole lot of people doing it in a relatively quick period of time, in a generation. Okay, and so what else? The other thing that we know about Florida, I just wanted to share some of these really cool artifacts with you. This very elaborate fishing technology in South Florida archaeology. And this is an example. A lot of these are from the Florida Museum of Natural History and I think originated over on the west coast of Florida, but they're all the kinds of things that we find here on this coast as well. So anchors made out of coral rock, all kinds of fish hooks. I didn't really throw in all of the different bone fish hooks that are popular at this time. Nets, we find actual fragments of net in submerged contexts in Florida. That's one of the rare things because these are organic, right? Made out of plant fibers. But we know that with the nets comes netted fish, right? And those are easy. Again, almost anybody can net fish. If you're in the Gulf of Mexico, even at the beginning of the 20th century, you could just walk into the Gulf and mullet would jump into your boat. So you don't have to be a super skilled cast net. And believe me, I've tried cast netting. It's not easy, but it isn't that complicated either because my brother can do it. Netted fish probably provided the biggest source of protein. When we've done excavations in the Keys, we look and see that the little tiny fish bones that show up in the screen are massive. They're just massive quantities of those. So you could net a whole bunch of fish, throw it in a pot, make a stew, high protein, feeds lots of people. So we have great technology from archaeology that shows us that fishing was sophisticated, it was sustainable, it was generating enough food for lots and lots of people. Also from archaeology, we know that all of these marine species and many others were important in the diet of the Tequesta. They're also important in other ways in Tequesta life. As was mentioned, the dolphin skull that's on exhibit here was offered in the middle of the Miami Circle, so it's clearly a ceremonial offering, political importance, but all the major large species were harvested, and this is gonna, if you're thinking fish, if you're a fish person, you know you don't catch this right off shore. You need to be out in deeper water, so that's gonna anticipate one of my other slides coming up. And then from downtown, from the Granada excavations in the 1970s, we found lots and lots of fruit nuts, right? The pits from fruits. All these native fruits that would have been available in the pine flatlands around Tequesta. And while we today might not like eating sea grapes, I've tried them. Actually, cocoa plums are not bad. Hog plums are not bad. If you're in a marine protein diet with wild food based, any sugar is appreciated, right? And also these fruits, interestingly, provided some really important phytochemicals that you wouldn't have gotten if you were eating primarily marine proteins. So fruits are an important part of the diet, and I've done some research on how fruits probably drew people out of the downtown river area into other environments, like the sea grapes. You have to go out to a barrier island to get sea grapes, right? All right, so these were water-born people. Their whole lives were spent traversing waterways and in dugout canoes. Very similar to the canoes that you will see today if you go to the Miccosukee Museum out in the Everglades, and a slightly different than the canoes you see in Seminole photographs, but still comparable. Narrow, high point of gravity, very easy to tip, but they have almost no draw, so you can go anywhere. You can go into very shallow mangrove areas, estuaries, along the coast. Not great for deep water, open water travel, so we don't really think that people use these canoes to go too far afield, although the whole question of travel between South Florida and Cuba is an open one that I'm always encouraging my students to think about. One of the most important pieces of indigenous engineering that I need to talk to you about is that the Calusa and the Tequesta, the Calusa are a similar group of people who lived on the West Coast, built a series of interconnected canals so that they could travel across the entire peninsula. So this is 1,000 years, 2,000 years before Tamiami Trail, same exact idea. Using the Caloosahatchee, and then connecting to Lake O, and then what's not on this map is using the Miami River to come down. And these were artificially created and then maintained over time. So here's an artist's reconstruction of what it looked like over on the Calusa side. In many cases, they were very straight, just like that. They were highly engineered. Again, this is a type of idea that one only has when one has a lot of free time to think about how to maximize movement and the transport of goods, right? So this is later in the whole story of South Florida, but these canals, which I was pleased to find that you can kind of recreate travel on them in something called the Calusa Blueway, were essential to life. And so when you think about, it's hard for us necessarily to imagine how much time people spent on the water. I've thought about this a lot working in the Keys, because we have, at the archaeological sites that are contemporary with Tequesta in the Keys, we have all the same trade items that they had here. So people were moving back and forth across Florida Bay and between the islands, and then up into the Everglades through the Shark Valley, et cetera, constantly, all the time. Much more frequently than we would even imagine, I think. All right, and then finally, I wanted to just show you the density of sites, right? So this is a student I've been working with who created maps. This is taking data from the master site file, which is a state maintained repository of all sites in South Florida. This is just Dade and Monroe counties. And these are sites that date to the time period we're talking about, Glades 2 and 3, which you don't need to know those terms, but basically here's the dates if you're interested. It's a lot of sites. It's a lot of people. The only places that aren't covered in sites are deep in the Everglades, and there probably are sites there that we just have never found. Archaeologists have been guilty of not wanting to go into the Everglades and wade through all those mosquito-y spots in order to find stuff. The sites we do have in the Everglades are usually related to some kind of construction or something that's happened there, or historic reoccupation when people were doing farming in the Everglades. So take this and I think double it. I mean, it's a lot of occupation, right? And what's kind of cool is that if you think about it, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties, anybody know what the population of those 3 counties combined was in 1900? Wild guess, anybody want to take a guess? 5,000 people total in those 3 counties combined in 1900. Not far, not long ago, right? Miami, the city of Miami in 1900 only had 1,600 people in it. So during Tequesta times, there were a lot more people living here. A lot more people than 1900. Not than today, of course. But that's part of the Miami story, is that explosion that we've seen in the city since 1900. But the point being that White people didn't think this was a great place to live until we had air conditioning, but that story is contradicted by Indigenous data, where there were lots and lots and lots of people living here in a sustainable manner off of wild food resources. All right, to talk about the actual capital, this site here right underneath us, this is a photo from the 1970s when the first excavations were done in downtown. There's been scholarly interest in the Tequesta capital since the 19th century. People noticed as they boated up and down the river or along the Atlantic coast that there were two large rock mounds right near the mouth of the river where it meets the bay. These were, we don't know what they were, but I'm gonna give you an idea that they were possibly sentinels to mark the opening of the river. They may have been magical or ceremonial spaces to mark the entrance of where the river met the bay. Unfortunately, most of those rock mounds were destroyed before anybody had time to really investigate them. There is one that's still, there's a few that still exist in various protected areas of South Florida, but in any case, those drew enough attention for people to say, something's going on here. But nobody really did excavation or much actual study until the 1970s, when I put this in particular because I wanted to make sure that Miami-Dade got the call, the shout out. And this was a very important project because it was sponsored by the state of Florida. They had all the best people involved. There was a beautiful report written up that was never published. So one of the reasons that we don't know more about the Tequesta is that report is circulated through Xeroxes amongst the academic community. So I have a Xerox of a Xerox of a Xerox from somebody's interlibrary loan where they got it from the state. And if you don't have those kinds of tools, it's very hard to get that information right, which is just a crying shame because that was a really cool project. All right, I also inserted here, this is one of the other pieces of carved bone. So the invitation for this talk had that granny knot carved bone, and there's actually quite a lot of carved bone from the Tequesta capital. And this is a topic of a lot of interest to me we're gonna talk about in just a moment. Luckily, those artifacts are preserved in the state archives in Tallahassee. So investigation of the Tequesta capital continues today. We have people here who were probably in the field today. There's tremendous amounts of excavation going on, as you have heard, as we talked about. It's been in the news a lot. This is because redevelopment has caused all of downtown to be targeted for, construction of new housing mostly, which we really all have to support, but it has generated a lot of archaeology, contract archaeology, which is when a developer has to legally do an investigation of the property that they're building on so that we will know what we're losing when they build a high rise, right? And that is essential to us preserving some of our cultural heritage. These are laws that have been in place in the United States since the 1970s, and it's really the fastest growing part of archaeology today, is this contract archaeology. And this is an awesome photo that I love, which was taken less than a year ago from one of the high rises right next to the site that's being excavated. It's about to be finished, and then looking toward the circle, right? So you can see how close we are to the circle. The one building right next to the tennis court is the next one that will come down and will probably be even more amazing in terms of the archaeology just because it's even closer to the circle. But that's, again, just a guess. We don't know for sure, but it will be a very, very important archaeological dig. From all of this, we are starting to get a fairly complete understanding of the Tequesta capital. And this is the illustration that Mal did based on combing through all kinds of different obscure reports, non-published journals from the 19th century, word of mouth from certain archaeologists. It's a real effort to get this information all in one place, but it gives you a sense a little bit about what it looked like. The larger hut in the top in the center there is the Miami Circle. There's a whole bunch of smaller structures next to it. Those rock mounds are either side of the river, right there by the bay. There's a burial mound that we chose not to put in here for various reasons, but other sorts of features, the rapids that were in the river at the time before the river was canalized as much as it is now, and the docks for canoe travel. So we put as much as we could. I'm sure that we will update this at some point, but we're starting to get a sense. Again, to me, as an archaeologist working in North America, it looks just like other southeastern centers. It's not, first of all, made by aliens. It's not made by Maya, ancient Maya people, and it is very much within the indigenous tradition of Florida and then the greater Southeast. Okay, I want to talk just a tiny bit about some of my own personal research that's related to this, which has to do with this idea of soft technologies. And I'm going to plant that term. Sounds like lingo or jargon, and it is, but it's actually very interesting jargon, so hopefully you'll appreciate that. Soft technologies are the types of technology that don't preserve well in the archaeological record. They're all the things that people made out of organics, like plant materials, bottle gourds, all the cloth that was made. And unless you're in Peru or Egypt, you don't get a chance to really look at, because especially in a tropical, semi-tropical environment like Miami, there's too much acidity in the soil, there's too much wet and dry and wet and dry, and nothing organic preserves in those kinds of conditions. We have extraordinary preservation if something is submerged in water completely, but that's a very rare occurrence, right? So soft technologies have not gotten a lot of attention in archaeology. We spend a huge amount of time on things like lithic points and pottery. Those are obviously durable, hard technologies. And turns out, in a lot of cases, the technologies that are often made by men in a lot of cultures. Soft technologies are often things that are made in the home. They're often things that are made by perhaps older people, perhaps women. Depends on the context, of course, but they're an important part of the whole story. So I'm interested in soft technologies. And we have, again, because of our extraordinary preservation, some examples of cloth. The site of Wendover is truly, again, another world-famous site. It's on the east coast of Florida, up by Canaveral, Wendover. It was, again, a story of a housing development going in, and the backhoe started churning up artifacts, and after calling the sheriff called the Florida State University Anthropology Department, and it turned into, I think, 5 years of excavation. Because it's a bog, it's like the Everglades, it's like the bogs of Northern Europe. Anything organic that fell into it, more or less, was preserved. And so from this site, we have tremendous textiles. And those textiles exhibit a lot of interesting technology, a lot of sophistication in the weaving. So an archaeologist named James Aravasio, who's pretty much the world expert on prehistoric textiles, he looked at them very carefully under a microscope and discovered that there were actually 7 different weaving techniques involved. And those then, of course, create a different final project or product. And they probably conveyed something about the person who was making the object as well. Obviously their skill level, but also maybe something else. When I looked at this carved bone from downtown and saw that it was a granny knot and looked at other kinds of knots, I was immediately thinking about textiles and plant textiles. A lot of cultures replicate plant textiles in more durable materials. And so I think something like that might be going on. In this case, we have a lot of carved bone from Granada or from downtown. And I think that the woven fabric that was used at Wendover to wrap bodies before they were put into burials, to cover people's bodies, to convey status, was the inspiration for some of this elaborate knotwork and crisscrossing and things like that, that there was a value in that sort of plant textile technology, and then that's replicated in these other forms. That carved bone from Tequesta fits within a regional tradition of carving, which is very sophisticated. So we're hopping over to the West Coast just for a moment to talk about Key Marco, another very, very important, again, world-famous site. Again, because it was submerged, this is a mess of a bog here where people just started pulling stuff out of the ground in the 19th century, called the Smithsonian, and they sent down an archaeologist to look at it, the material. And it was a total mess. They just pulled stuff out, and they sent half of it to University of Pennsylvania. And here we are in Key Marco. But the objects that came out of the ground were primarily organic. They were carved wooden objects. So this is a watercolor that was made at the time. And thank goodness, because a lot of those objects in the 19th century, they did not have conservation science. And so a lot of those wooden objects just crumbled into dust. Some of them, however, managed to survive. This is an example of a sea turtle that's one of the most beautiful pieces of pre-Columbian art from Florida. This is the original piece, still in very, very good condition, and this is the watercolor that the project artist made, and that preserves some of the color that was on the object when it came out of the ground. The reason I'm including these is this shows you this using wood and other soft technologies to create art as a medium for art that we often forget when we're only looking at the most durable of materials. And I couldn't resist, is a better term, including the cat, the Key Marco cat. If you didn't already know about this, is probably, again, one of the most famous pieces. I see one of the Key Marco cat fans in the audience. One of the most famous pieces of pre-Columbian art ever. It's a beautiful, perfectly preserved object carved in wood. We don't know exactly what kind of wood. We know it's a hardwood. It's been at the Smithsonian forever and ever and ever, and it's currently in the Marco Island Historical Museum. Is that the right name? I think so. Until at least 2026, on loan from the Smithsonian. So please do go see it if you're excited about this art, because it's moving to see it in person. So point being that the small little bone pins that we have from downtown are part of this tradition of carving and using sort of a plastic arts to convey information. What that information is still to be figured out. It hasn't really been, not too many people have thought about it carefully, but it's something that I think is worth thinking about more. These are mostly examples from the 1970s, and then this is just, the tool that would have been used, a shark's tooth. It makes a very effective wood carving tool. All right. I'm hopeful that we will continue to find more carved bone as we excavate downtown. These are all from the current excavations, and you can see that we have extraordinary organic preservation. These are objects that were found beneath the original shoreline, where the river has been extended a bit. This is a pestle used for grinding. This is perhaps something like that, like a base, but it's also called a fire starter. These are actual pieces of twine and wood. They haven't been carbon dated yet, but I would guess that they're probably going to come back from like 700 AD or somewhere around that. It's really extraordinary preservation. And just briefly, this is a big topic, but something that's contemporary with the site downtown, the Tequesta capital, is a phenomenon we call the Hopewell interaction sphere. And this is something, again, archaeologists don't fully understand, but we know that there was a belief system shared amongst a very wide area that manifested itself in the exchange of some pretty unusual exotic goods. And so a big part of that was marine shell from the Gulf of Mexico, which was traded up. Not that it all went to the site of Hopewell, that this illustration is a little misleading in that sense, but that it moved all over the East Coast, really the Southeast in particular. So you find shark's teeth and marine shell up here in Virginia. You find it in the Great Lakes. You find it all throughout the Southeast. And likewise, in exchange, things like copper and silver from the Great Lakes, which wash up on the shores there in abundance, made it all the way down into Florida. So for a long time, we've thought that, we don't know if this means, obviously, not obvious to you guys, maybe you don't know this. There's no empire that's organizing all of this. There's no state that's commanding people to move these goods around. People are doing this on a relatively voluntary basis. They understand that there's something valuable in these materials, and there's something useful to being in exchange, to being in connection with people who have the other ones. And so they're trading them, probably down the line. Like one guy's just carrying all his shell up to Etowah, and then he's handing a whole bunch of it off to somebody else and getting something cool in exchange, like galena, the shiny mineral, and he's walking his way back down to Florida. But it's a meaningful pattern nonetheless, right? There doesn't have to be a state or an empire or anything controlling all of this. It shows a shared belief system, a participation in something bigger than any one community. And what's super exciting is that the materials that have come out of the current excavations downtown are approaching 100% participation in the Hopewell interaction sphere. A lot of these same kinds of things are moving into the capital downtown. And for a long time, we thought Hopewell didn't go any farther than Lake O. It wasn't something that the South Florida people participated in, and now we're starting to change all of those ideas. So this is just really to underscore the fact that the people who are living here, while they lived in a particularly unusual environment in terms of, in comparison to other people in the Southeast, were in contact and sharing ideas and believing in similar kinds of things to people throughout that whole region. This is the archaeologically known area of ancient Tequesta. This is a map that only represents, again, where there has been archaeological investigation. If we were able to dig right here, I'm sure we would find something that would expand the boundaries of this site. But this gives you an idea kind of how much we already know about where Tequesta was and how much more we will find out. So as redevelopment happens down Brickell, which is what's going to happen, right? All these condos that were built in the 50s or 70s that are only 2 or 3 stories are going to turn into mega high-rises again over the next few years. We're going to hear a lot more about Tequesta archaeology. And I hope that we will think carefully about what we want to do with that, whether we're going to excavate them 100%, as is currently the model, and just hope for the best with finding more information or storing and curating all those artifacts, and somebody will study them someday kind of an approach, or whether we will set aside parts and save them for future excavations when people have better technology, better skills, better questions about the past. If you'd like to learn more about the Tequesta, I recommend all of these sources. And I'm, of course, happy to answer questions in just a moment here, but you have to see the exhibit in History Miami. Digging Miami is written by Robert Carr, who's done the most excavation of any human in South Florida. It's an amazing book. You have to visit the Atatiki if you haven't been there. It's a beautiful world-class museum. And then Trail of Florida's Indian Heritage has a very useful web presence. It's a resource that guides you to sites which are open to the public throughout the entire state of Florida. It helps you understand Florida's indigenous heritage. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to continue the conversation. Any questions? I won't call on you like I do in my class. Yes?
So you were talking about hard and soft technologies, and I was wondering, what does the archaeological record, and specifically soft technologies and hard technologies, say about warfare? Was there any kind of evidence of warfare happening down here in South Florida?
Sure. Yeah. So, as archaeological signatures of warfare are things like weapons, things like defensive moats or barricades, or situating a settlement on an island or on the top of a hill so you can see everybody who's coming at you. For South Florida, we don't have a ton of that. We have, your normal spear points, arrow points, things that would have been used primarily for hunting, but could have been used against humans who were bothering you. And we do know from the Spanish accounts that people bothered each other a lot, that there were some very serious, long-standing resentments between the Calusa and the Tocobaga of Tampa Bay. And the Calusa at one point get really mad at the Spanish because the Spanish don't kill all the Tocobaga when they go up to visit the Tocobaga. They're like, you had the perfect opportunity to kill all the Tocobaga and you didn't. We don't want to have anything to do with you anymore. So yeah, there was obviously conflict, but there were no standing militaries. We're not talking about the kind of state-level apparatus that would have been able to support a military, like professional warriors who would need to be fed and trained and housed because they weren't growing their own food or harvesting their own food. We don't see that. So we see people who were probably part-time warriors and mostly hunters. Yeah, and that is something to look at through hard technology because spear points, anything made out of stone, preserves well.
I guess, I don't know if anybody else has questions, but can I ask another one?
You could.
So, do you think possibly that the dominant view that people have in the past, that our past was more warlike than our present day, is because of archaeology's like fixture on hard technologies?
Wow, that's an awesome point. Thank you for making that point. That is exactly the kind of thing that happens when we focus on hard technology or any one aspect of the past, right? So if we're looking at documents, Spanish documents, we're gonna think a certain thing about the past because our sources are skewed. And everybody knows that, but we don't think about it quite as much when we think about archaeology. So in this case, yes, if we are only looking for the most durable objects, we're gonna find a lot of weapons. We're gonna find a lot of tools, a lot of things for killing things, whether that be animals or people or plants. Yeah, thank you. Good point. Should be an archaeologist. Anyone else? Yes?
What ended up happening to the people?
Okay, good question. The Tequesta, a whole bunch of Tequesta, a few hundred. Okay, the Spanish come and there are thousands of Tequesta. There's 10,000, we don't know. We can't really make good estimates on the numbers of people. From Spanish accounts, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people are living in South Florida when the Spanish arrive, and this is after the peak of the Tequesta. So the peak, Tequesta already starting to kind of unravel a little bit. Diseases, even though no Spaniard has ever set foot on Florida, diseases that Spaniards brought to the New World are already making an impact on South Florida because the indigenous people of South Florida are back and forth throughout the Caribbean. So for the same reason, the Calusa, when they first meet the Spanish, the very first time the Spanish ever go to Calusa, the Calusa are already speaking Spanish and hating the Spanish. They already know what's going on. They have the whole thing figured out. And so, what was the question? What happened? What happened? Okay, so it's the same sad story in terms of disease impact. And many, many people became sick. The Spanish captured people and took them as slaves. So settlements became impoverished in terms of not having their most knowledgeable people, not having as many people. Even in places in North Florida where there was a more peaceable relationship with the Spaniards when they arrived, populations declined. And so from 1513 until 1760s, the Tequesta, along with their cousins, the Calusa, resisted Spanish colonization. The Spaniards tried twice to establish missions right here in downtown Miami, and both times they failed miserably. One time it only lasted for a few months before the priest begged to be returned to Havana because he was in so much danger, and the other time it lasted for a year before the same thing happened. So nobody here wanted to practice agriculture, which is what the Spaniards wanted the indigenous people to do. They were using the same model that they used in Hispaniola. Let's round up the indigenous people and make them farm for us so that we can take that food, and then that'll feed us while we go out and look for land to conquer or for gold to find. And nobody here in Florida was having it. They were like, no, we don't need to farm. We understand corn agriculture. It's practiced a few hundred miles up the road, but it's not us. And so they resisted Spanish colonization. However, they were decimated by disease, and then the final perfect storm blow was when the English show up in Florida, and the English pirates were given free rein to slave as much as they wanted under English law, and so they were constantly capturing indigenous people. And that's when some Tequesta and Calusa asked to go to Havana. They said, the Spanish are better than the English, we'll be safer in Havana. I believe, and this story has changed and evolving over the course of my career, this story has changed because you will often read that the Tequesta disappeared. I believe that like indigenous people everywhere in the New World, probably many Tequesta people fled into the interior of the state. They fled into remote and inaccessible areas where the Spanish didn't want to go and where the British weren't going to go. And so those people then lived in the Everglades and joined with the Seminole when the Seminole moved into Florida. And those are the stories the Seminole tell as well. Miccosukee and Seminole talk about having Calusa ancestors. So,
Are things changing with like DNA studies? Are we able to like figure out if people do have ancestry or like what's their genes?
Yes, the short answer is yes. There's a lot of resistance to doing DNA studies within Native American populations today in North America, and more openness to it in the Caribbean, but not as much access to it, right? So you have to have the money to do that kind of thing. So I encourage anybody who's Cuban heritage to do DNA, just because it's super important and interesting for us to understand Cuba being one of the most complicated crossroads of the world. But yeah, so we might eventually, we just don't have the data right now to pin down other, you'll do that test and it'll say Native American, but it won't tell you if you're Taino or Tequesta. Yeah.
Do you have, is there like anything that would point to what social hierarchies look like?
Well, the Spanish were very clear that they were talking to the chief, and they called the chief of the Calusa the king, and they called the chief of the Tequesta the king. I've questioned those terms just because the Spanish, these are guys who spent time in in central Mexico, among the Aztec Empire. And they are coming from a culture in Spain, which is extremely hierarchical and rigid. And so they're using those same concepts. They show up and they're like, take me to the most important person. Who's your king? And of course they said that in Spanish. And so nobody knew what anybody was saying. That the role of interpreters is super important. But so if you look at those accounts, you think, okay, they had kings and they had royalty. The king of the Calusa passes on control of the Calusa to his son, and that passes on again. The other way to look at it is through archaeology and say, do we see a lot of stratification? Do you see some people living a more privileged life? Like they had access to extreme resources that everybody else didn't have. They had a house high up on a shell mound where there was lots of nice breeze that blew away the mosquitoes, and they didn't have to smell everything that was going on down on the ground surface. And we do have that in the Calusa world. We don't have as much of that in the Tequesta, although there's been this constant impact on the archaeological record here to know. Yeah.
Anything to point to spiritual beliefs specifically and how that affected how they viewed the world?
Yeah. For the Calusa, we have a very unique source on that. And so somebody named Father Juan Rogel, he was the Franciscan minister who tried to establish a mission in Calusa land and was eventually run off. But he spent enough time to learn the Calusa language and to write down some of their spiritual beliefs about the way the world worked. And the one that I'll just give you as an example is that there were 3 places in the body in which the soul dwelled. One was the head, one was the pupil, and one was the heart. And that as one died, that soul then transferred into an animal. And then as that animal died, it transferred into another animal or into a plant. And so from that, you can tell there's just this very profound interconnection, and that humans are not different or set aside, apart from the rest of the living world. So you can read Father Rogel. His accounts have been published in translation and in Spanish as well, if you're interested. Of course, he's got his own perspective, yeah. All right, I don't know how we're doing on time. Yeah, is there anything, one more question? Yes?
Yeah, I actually had 2. One was when you showed the map of the population densities across South Florida and Tequesta, what was like a peak population or estimates around the peak population? Was that around that time period?
Yeah, let's say around 900 or so, I think is what most of us would agree is a peak, although we really need a lot more information to be able to say that. I don't know. I'm not going to give you a number. I'm sorry. I don't believe in population estimates in archaeology. The way we do them is that we look at all the houses and then we multiply that by 5.5. It's ridiculous. And we don't have all the houses, so we can't. It's really, really very, very, very sketchy. But just from the number of sites, and the fact that there was, the Spanish accounts describe there being, the landscape was full. There were people everywhere. People knew about other settlements and moved through the landscape a lot. I mean, so I don't know, but it was a lot.
My other question pertained to the canal systems. From my understanding, the accounts that I've read about the Miami River was that it only ran about 30 miles west from the bay to the head springs. Is that incorrect?
No, that's correct, but it is connected then through other waterways. Yeah. Yeah. So that was an engineering feat that took natural features and then augmented them through human design. All right, well, thank you so very, oh wait, one more, okay, yes.
I'm curious about, regarding disease, was there any knowledge of disease amongst the Tequestas, or was it mainly brought over from?
Oh no, absolutely. There was a very, I'm sure, a sophisticated apothecary of herbs. We know this because of Windover. So that site that I told you about by Cape Canaveral, where there was everything was submerged, there were many individuals found there, and they were so well preserved that their stomach contents were even preserved. And there were a couple of individuals who have stomachs full of elderberries, for example, and other kinds of herbs that are known to have medicinal characteristics. So Seminole people have a very complex and sophisticated herbal apothecary also, which they keep private to themselves, but we know that it exists, and so it's very likely that there was a lot of medical sort of treatments for various ailments. The other thing that's interesting about Windover is there were a lot of people there who had injuries, but who were continuing to be supported by their community.
Okay, so the diseases that were brought over, they were just not prepared maybe to treat those as well?
Immune systems were just not prepared for, right? Even things like the common cold made a big impact on Indigenous people because there had been so very, very long between the two populations that the diseases really hit people hard. Okay, thank you so much for your attention and for this opportunity.